Welcome to the History Guy Podcast, a podcast dedicated to stories of lesser-known historical events told by Lance Geiger, also known as the History Guy on YouTube. I'm Josh, your host, a writer for the channel and eldest son of the History Guy. We tell all kinds of stories about history, from the modern era to the ancient past, so you never know what we're going to talk about next. One thing you can be sure of, it is history that deserves to be remembered. On today's episode, the History Guy tells two stories of engineering feats in New York City. First, he tells the story of Alfred Beech's secret subway, and then he talks about some of the lesser-known historical tales of the building of the Brooklyn Bridge. Without further ado, let me introduce the History Guy.
In 1867, people of all types crowded up to the 14th Street Armory in New York City to attend the 37th Annual American Institute Fair, where an enterprising inventor was demonstrating a revolutionary new idea. Only 4 years previously, the London Underground, the world's first subway system, had been opened, but they were plagued by the soot of their steam-powered engines. The inventor of this new device, Alfred Beech, promised something similar and yet different. But his vision for the future of transportation would end up mired in the politics and economics of its present. The history of New York's secret subway deserves to be remembered.
Alfred Beech was born on September 1st, 1826, in Springfield, Massachusetts, the son of Moses Beech, owner of the New York Sun, and one of the founders of the Associated Press. The Beech family became wealthy thanks to the paper, and Alfred was sent to a prestigious private school for his education. His father had not been born wealthy and had shown an interest in invention early in his life, inventing a rag-cutting machine and attempting to manufacture a gunpowder engine for propelling balloons. Alfred's first job was selling newspapers on the corner of New York City streets as a newsboy, but he was soon setting type and later became a reporter. In 1845, Alfred and several friends paid $800 for the then obscure Scientific American magazine. The magazine had only a few hundred subscribers when they purchased it. Beech soon launched the Scientific American Patent Agency, which promised to help inventors secure patents, for a fee, of course. It was the first business of its kind, and soon the agency was filing 3,000 patents a year, and by 1848 the magazine had 10,000 readers.
Through Scientific American, Beech helped Thomas Edison patent the phonograph. He also worked with Alexander Graham Bell and Samuel Morse. In 1848, Moses Beech retired and left control of the Sun to Alfred, then just aged 22, and his brother.
Alfred was not just the proprietor of the most important magazine on inventions, but like his father was a tinkerer too. In 1856, he appeared at the American Institute Fair with an improvement to the typewriter, which could make embossed letters, which he saw as a means of helping the blind. While it was never produced, it won a gold medal and first prize at the fair that year and was recognized as the most advanced typewriting machine yet. The typewriter was hardly his most ambitious project. From his office on the top floor in New York City, he had a good view of the crowded city streets and the ferries that increasingly carried commuters from Manhattan, Staten Island, and New Jersey. City streets in the mid-19th century were often muddy, trash-strewn, and literally covered in horse poop. Large cities moved slowly as gridlock carriages fought for inches and horses screamed. "We can travel from New York halfway to Philadelphia in less time than the length of Broadway," complained a writer in the New York Tribune. Beech's own short walk from his home to his office could take an hour and was fraught with the possibility of getting crushed or trampled. As author and physician Asa Green wrote, "To cross the street in New York, you must button your coat tight about you, see that your shoes are secure at the heels, settle your hat firmly on your head, look up street and down street at the self-same moment to see what carts and carriages are upon you, and then run for your life." Beech proposed a solution in Scientific American in November that year. Nothing less than a railway underneath instead of above. This subterranean passage is to be laid down with double track, with a road for foot passengers on either side, the whole to be brilliantly lighted with gas. He imagined carriages pulled by horses, with openings to his subway on every corner.
While his idea might seem prescient today, it was widely ridiculed at the time. One critic opined, "It is better to wait for the devil than to make roads down to hell."
The issue of city congestion was well established, and solutions had appeared. In 1827, a predecessor to the bus, which could carry 12 people, was constructed for Abraham Bauer. He charged 12 cents a trip, but the idea only caught on in New York and Boston. In Europe, Paris and London were home to an even larger vehicle, an omnibus. In 1831, Bauer introduced an omnibus to New York and soon had over 100 of the things, horse-drawn, in the city. The buses, however, were dangerous and dirty and often raced each other for fares, grazing lampposts all the way. The New York Herald would eventually describe them exasperatedly as bedlam on wheels, while another writer said that they were dirty and filled with brutal ruffians. By 1832, 30-passenger trolleys driven by horse along rails in the city were first introduced in New York. None solved the problem of traffic. On January 9, 1863, London welcomed the Metropolitan Railway after 4 years of digging through the dirt to produce the world's first subway. To Londoners, the system became known as the Underground, or is better known today, the Tube. But the initial system wasn't without its problems. The trains were steam-powered, and burning steam engines poured soot-filled smoke into the tunnels. The chief inspector of railways warned that an underground road is enormously expensive to construct and interfered with above-ground transportation while it was being built, that it can never be wholesome or free of deleterious gases, and in foggy weather is always full of a thick atmosphere, which is very disagreeable to the passengers. Around the same time, Beech also heard about another British invention. In 1853, Josiah Latimer Clark had built the Electric and International Telegraph Company, a 1.5-inch tube from a telegraph station to the London Stock Exchange. Their tube was pneumatic and delivered small canisters with telegraphs to brokers. With Thomas Webster Rammel, Clark was able to sell the tubes to the British Post, and in 1863 they had carts installed in the system, which brought parcels and letters straight from the railway to the post office. Mechanics magazine declared that we feel tolerably certain that the day is not very distant when metropolitan railway traffic can be conducted on this principle. Beech certainly thought so. By 1865, Beech had patented his own pneumatic mail system, which he envisioned beneath all of the city streets. People could drop a letter into a hollow streetlight, which would be collected by a small rail car. He also began preparation for his display at the 1867 American Institute Fair, which brought 2 inventions, and he knew that a flair for the dramatic could sell an invention. His first invention was a 24-foot-long tube, 2 feet wide, which could move packages by air pressure. Much more impressive was his second display, which hung from the ceiling, stretching across the room. He had built a long plywood tube, and inside was a cylindrical car that just barely fit within. The car could hold 10 people and was powered by a large steam-powered fan. With access to Scientific American and the New York Sun, it was simple to drum up excitement, and thousands came to the fair just to take a ride on Beech's pneumatic contraption. Before the fair opened, he had declared in Scientific American that he had developed a system of transportation swift as Aeolus, god of the breezes, and silent as Somnus, god of sleep and dreams. Halfway through the fair, Scientific American carried an article which began, "The most novel and attractive feature of the exhibition is by general consent conceded to be the pneumatic railway. It is probable that a pneumatic railway of considerable length for regular traffic will soon be laid down near New York," Beech predicted. More than 75,000 people would ride the railway by the end of the fair. The New York Times wrote that passengers through a city tube could be carried from City Hall to Madison Square in 5 minutes, to Harlem and Manhattanville in 14 minutes, to Washington Heights in 20 minutes. Beech won top prize.
A good idea is not, however, by itself enough to change the world. Beech was facing opposition from 2 important forces. Property owners like John Jacob Astor III, who didn't want New York City's streets dug up to build subways, and the powerful leader of the New York City political machine, William Boss Tweed.
Tweed refused to let Beech get funding or a charter. In 1869, Beech instead applied for a pneumatic mail system by proposing a mail tube near Broadway. He planned 2 4.5-foot diameter tubes, too small for people to ride. Tweed gave the go-ahead, and Beech was granted a 50-year charter. But Beech never intended to give up that easily. With Tweed satisfied, Beech returned to the legislature asking for a minor change. Instead of 2 tubes, he would build 1 larger tube at a cheaper rate than the 2. And 2 smaller tubes would be contained within the larger tunnel. He also deleted the clause for regulatory inspection. Tweed seems not to have noticed the significance of the changes. The scene was set for Beech to build his subway, in secret, almost right across the street from City Hall. To prove to property owners it wouldn't disturb their property, Beech invented a drill with a unique curved shield that used hydraulic rams, could move 16 inches of soil at a time. Beginning in the gigantic basement of Devlin's clothing store, 2 floors underground, his teams worked at night, trucking out dirt in wagons. It was not easy work, claustrophobic and sometimes terrifying. They could dig up to 8 feet a night. During construction, the shield of Beech's digger suddenly ground to a halt, and the shield buckled. They had to run into a solid wall, apparently from an old Dutch fort that had been there before the Revolution. It's unclear if removing the wall would cause damage to the road above, but the workers chipped away at the wall, which didn't cause total collapse. It was impossible to keep the work secret, as huge pieces of machinery waited on the street and dirt constantly came to the surface. Reports on the work were common and speculation rife. New York Mayor Abraham Hall became suspicious and sent an aide with an order to inspect the construction when a part of Broadway sunk into the ground slightly. But the aide was refused entry because Beech's change in the legislation excluded regulatory oversight. In a statement, Beech brushed aside rumors. In reference to the ridiculous stories that have been circulated about our men being sworn to secrecy and the doors being closed to all persons, there's no truth to them. Meanwhile, he was outfitting his large car to look like a lounge and hold 22 people. His enormous fan, actually a mine ventilation fan, weighed 50 tons. It drew air through a grate, which caused winds so great it could blow a passerby's hat off. The car could achieve speeds of 6 miles an hour, blown halfway where it hit a bell, and then the fan was reversed, bringing it to a smooth stop. In January of 1870, one of Beech's partners assured everyone that public inspection would soon be welcomed and mentioned a waiting room. It was becoming clear that Beech wasn't building a mail tube. On January 11th, a New York Daily Tribune reporter who somehow got access to the tunnel reported on the entire thing. Beech's son Frederick later claimed that the reporter had been disguised as a workman, but it is difficult to ignore the brilliant marketing tactic that leaking the description of the project was. Beech had spent some $70,000 building a stunning waiting room, 120 feet long, with paintings, chandeliers, mirrors, a grand piano, and even a fountain stocked with goldfish. On February 26, 1870, Beech finally invited lawmakers, dignitaries, and reporters into the basement. The response was universal acclaim. Certainly the most novel, if not the most successful enterprise that New York has seen for many a day is the pneumatic tunnel under Broadway, wrote the New York Times. A myth or a humbug it has hitherto been called by everybody who has been excluded from its interior, but now it will be open to the public. Such is expected to find a dismal cavernous retreat, open their eyes at the elegant reception room, in the light, airy tunnel, and the general appearance of taste and comfort. Beech opened the subway to the public on March 1st, 1870, at 25 cents a ride. He promised to donate all the proceeds to the Union House for the orphans of soldiers and sailors. The public rode and rode and rode, some simply remaining in their seats as it traveled 1 block one way and then back the other. Beech promised that the day had passed when a snowstorm could cripple the city and travel would soon be free of horses in crowded streets. We propose to run the line to Central Park, about 5 miles in all, Beech said, and when completed, we should be able to carry 20,000 passengers a day at speeds up to a mile a minute. In less than a year, 400,000 people rode Beech's subway. Beech was raising money and seeking to get an extension of his line. But Tweed had his own plan and was possibly angry at being fooled. He had the legislature pass his viaduct plan, which called for elevated rail lines throughout the city, at the same time as Beech's, and both bills arrived on the governor's desk. New York Governor John Hoffman vetoed Beech's bill and approved Tweed's. But Tweed wasn't invincible. Dogged by criticism in the press and a deadly riot, the New York Times began to get information from a new state auditor through former Sheriff James O'Brien about the city's accounts, which laid bare the ring's embezzlement of city funds. Tweed's power crumbled, and he was arrested. It took Beech a year and a half to get another bill before the Senate, and in the interim he had decided that his pneumatic system was impractical and he'd have to use steam engines. The bill passed on April 6, 1873, but it was too late. After years of waiting, he didn't have investors ready, and the economy collapsed in September. The Depression was so bad that it became known at the time as the Great Depression, until the Depression of the 1930s proved even worse. Beech was bankrupt and exhausted, and he gave up his dream. His tunnel was converted into a shooting gallery and then a wine vault before he finally sealed it up in 1874.
The tunnel, which was located where the City Hall subway station is today, was destroyed in 1912 by workers who were expanding the New York City subway system, which had been opened in 1904. They said at the time that the tunnel had been left virtually intact, that the piano was still in the waiting room. Beech himself did not live to see the New York City subway. He passed away in 1896. Of course, pneumatic messaging systems are still around today. You see them in bank drive-thrus. They're being used in some hospitals, some businesses. The CIA had a large pneumatic messaging system in its headquarters until 1989. The website Tomorrow's World Today notes that in 2021, the global pneumatic tube market was valued at $2.4 billion. And while pneumatic people transportation hasn't yet taken hold, technologies such as vac trains and hyperloops have gained enough traction that in 2021, the U.S. Department of Transportation released proposed rules to regulate such technology. And so Beech's vision of transportation from the past might yet become our mode of mass transportation in the future.
Now's the part of the episode where we get to chat with the history guy. A little bit about what we just heard, what we're going to hear, and some behind-the-scenes stuff that you only get to hear about on the podcast. So both of these episodes are really interesting and get to talk about an amazing city and a city that has a lot of history, and that's New York City. And these are both, places where I don't know if you necessarily expect them to be connected through these these specific engineering ways, but it makes sense too that a big city is going to have to need.
Yeah, it's always been a dynamic city in U.S. history. We've ended up doing a lot of episodes on New York, given that neither one of us are from New York and have not spent a lot of time there. I spent a little bit of time there, but I mean, I can tell how dynamic the city was because I certainly remember going to New York when the towers dominated the skyline.
Yeah.
And then I got to go to New York when the Scar dominated the skyline. And then the last time I was back in New York, and it's been a couple of years, it's changed. I mean, the lower Manhattan doesn't look the same at all. I mean, they've completely replaced that with buildings that look completely different. That you can have these, the sorts of skyscrapers that, alter the skyline of a major city. And that those are that, in the course of a lifetime, you're literally seeing that occur. That just shows how dynamic that city can be. And there's a historian, I forget who it was, but a historian, but essentially said that every inch of New York City has also been bathed in blood, and that's true. There's been so we've done an awful lot of riots in New York City too, right? So I mean, a lot goes on in New York City, but it shouldn't be a surprise that some of the marvels of engineering in American history are going to go on in New York City, because that's always been a primary port. It's always been the nation's largest city since for a very, sorry, that was Baltimore, but for a very long time, New York City's been the largest city, and it is a city of commerce. And so it's not a surprise that we have a lot going on. It's also an island, so not a surprise that we're building bridges and subways because there's nowhere to grow the other directions, right? So I think that all makes sense. And it makes these parts of it iconic, and that makes for, I think, a worthy discussion, a fun discussion. The forgotten subway is really interesting too. The secret subway is really interesting too, because people walked over it for, it's not there anymore, but people walked over, they didn't know it was there.
Yeah, for years, it was, gosh, it ended up just kind of falling into disuse. But Alfred Beech, who is the mastermind behind all of it, is an interesting fellow. We ended up spending quite some time on his early life because, he's the reason Scientific American is what Scientific American is, and
it still is. And we reference Scientific American fairly frequently.
Oh yeah, it's
and also the old issues of Scientific American are a goldmine for stuff for the history guy. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a matter of fact, both the episodes that we're going to talk about today end up going beyond the kind of the topic of the episode to talk about a lot of other things that are going on at the period. And really, these represent. That's what you can say about the secret subway. Is that it also represents an era of dreams, an era of engineering, an era of technological advancement, an era when people would invest in a lot of stuff because they had a lot of hopes of things that are going on. Kind of represents the whole idea of the Gilded Age, that maybe sometimes dreams were exceeding the ability to reach it, and sometimes the wealth was a little more than gold pounded on the outside, and the people underneath that there was always an underclass too. This kind of tells that whole story about it, and it's just an interesting engineering story. It deserves to be remembered for that alone.
Yeah, it's such an interesting story. You end up liking Beech as a character to being someone who. Boss Tweed is definitely not going to let him do it. Not really for any better reason than Boss Tweed's not going to let him do it. And he decides, I'm going to do it anyway. And he just straight up lies honestly, he outmaneuvered in order to make this thing happen. And I think he really believed that once people saw it, that money would come in, and that Tweed wouldn't be able to essentially oppose it anymore. And that ends up not really working out for him, but.
Yeah, it is. As a story, it would be a happier ending if he really, because subways were definitely the way to go. It was certainly the only answer to what was going on in New York City was to be able to go both up and down and use all the space that they could.
Yep.
So this would be in some ways a better story if it had the happy ending. But Yeah, what's the movie The Pretenders where he says this way it's poetry?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, sometimes a happy ending isn't what you need to be important history, and sometimes that's poetry, you know.
Yeah. Well, and it's, ultimately so many things change too between when he builds this and when, the subways that we actually made and the subways that we use today. I think he's an interesting guy who was doing interesting inventions. His typewriter that would emboss, paper is an interesting invention. It's a good idea. I think that we decided that like Braille, where you weren't just feeling letters on paper, was actually a lot easier for people to read if they couldn't see. But the concept of having a typewriter that did that that's an interesting. That he was in a place where that was an interesting way.
So
to do
he was a
things.
visionary, did a lot of things, and you're right about the technology change. Maybe it wasn't quite right to do the subway. I don't know. Imagine a subway that's pulled by a coal-fired steam engine.
Yeah.
Or by a horse.
That seemed to be
which way.
The trouble in the early underground in London is that it was just disgusting down there because you're just pumping
soot, smoke, into
and if you've
space,
got horses anywhere, then you've just got horse poop too. That's the other.
Well, and it's funny that they're laughing about the omnibus and because honestly the buses in New York still don't smell that good. So
that's
if you've ever been on the subway, it's not necessarily roses, and that's just when you're moving that many people around. That's going to be part of what goes on. So it's kind of funny to think that all the reasons that you might say make fun of the subway today or mistrust the subway today for safety, which I don't want to get anybody get mad at me about saying New York's unsafe, but yes, you gotta look both ways when you're on the subway. I'm sure that was true. Yeah. When you were having a horse-drawn bus too. The same people are still shoved onto the same island.
Those omnibuses were crazy, and they're trying to figure out how to move people faster. But traffic was. It seems like traffic then. Traffic is bad today, but we have some sense of order, and it really feels like at that time they were like, "There's a road and stuff is going to happen on it." And
that's right. We have an episode on just a little line down the middle of the road too. Yeah. But and we also have an episode on the epizootic, which with when you had that many horses, then that was there was that particular risk to it, and the idea that all these horses that were pulling all these wagons and carts and buses and all that sort of thing to move people around, they weren't treated very well. They couldn't be. There's not the space to do that, and they were worked well beyond when they should have been worked, and they took them when they were sick because they couldn't afford not to. And,
we see that with cars today, but those aren't alive. People use them past and they're breaking down.
But people are still going to argue that cars are offering some kind of. But at some point in New York, their way of dealing with litter was just to let pigs wander the street.
Well, that was essentially the Middle Ages. That's all they did. That's how they dealt with
garbage. And there's story Europeans coming here saying you got to watch out for the pigs because they're dangerous. The wild pigs and dogs were a problem, and there's when you congregate that many people in limited space, and you stack them on top of each other, then lots of things happen, and that's why we talk about riots, but we also talk about blizzards paralyzing the city, and then we talk about the great feats of engineering that had to be done in order to make people be able to get on and off that island.
Yeah, well, obviously,
it's a good story.
The concept of the subway was right, and I guess ultimately it seems like even he decided maybe the idea of it being pneumatic was not as it was just not going to work in a large scale, which is no one has done.
It would be kind of cool if we could all work like the little machine at the bank, and
suck everybody up.
And maybe at some point then we'll be able to do like whatever maglev with superconductors and you'll be able to. I don't have any idea, but it does seem. It seemed a thing to do at the time. And it's we wonder how many, for all the things that we figured out, you wonder how many ideas that someone thought was a good idea that didn't work out because you have to try those. And the other cool story is that you never know, especially when you're in a city that old, you just never know. And it's funny because anybody in Europe's going to laugh about us saying New York City's old, but you never know what you're walking over too. There's so much underneath because the city has such history.
When they were digging this one, they run into what they think is like some old fort. Although I tried to look into what fort that could have been, and I didn't really find any historical evidence that would suggest that there was a fort there. So I'm not sure what they ran into. But the idea that
foundation too
could have been. Anything, right?
In London all the time, they go to build a car park and they find a Roman fort, or they find or they find a graveyard, or they find. That's
One time they found a
how
king.
things work. Yeah, that's true. Well, they were looking for him, I think, but yeah. Under the car park, they found. Yeah, that's a good story too. But I mean, it's one of the lessons of the secret subway is that we don't know. I live near St. Louis. I don't know if everybody knows that. And St. Louis had these caverns that were used as huge beer gardens. And I mean, they were massive caverns. And I mean, they would have hundreds of people down there, in what, essentially you could store the beer down there. And no one knows where they are now. No one knows where the entrances are. So presumably they're still there, but they're lost.
Gosh, that's crazy. Yeah, that's an interesting.
Yeah. And you wonder what's in there, and that's what you get with when they went down in the secret subway, where they went to build a new subway, and they found the piano still there. I mean, that is
crazy.
To me just. Yeah, that is, and it makes such an essence of the story that you wanted him to succeed. His plans weren't really going to work out, but I mean, in the end, it lasted longer than you would have imagined, and that's what history is all about. And that is, if there's a great model for what is forgotten history, which is what we love to talk about in the History Guy, it's that secret subway, which was literally just lost, forgotten, and then
totally
there it was.
Totally just forgot about it. They used it as like a pool hall for a little while, and then just closed it up. And that's that's amazing to think that there were these things that were big deals, that thousands of people were excited to ride on it and all this stuff, and then ultimately everyone forgot about it. But it's also, I try to think of, in 1867, you walk into that this big display that he has at the American Institute, and how much like the future that must have felt. When this is well before motor vehicles, you're in your horses and carriages, and it's just absolute chaos. And he has built this enormous fan powered thing that he can shoot you around the room, and not that fast, but pretty fast, for the
people
time.
Well, I mean, it would be fun to go back to the to one of the World's Fairs or the Columbian exhibition or one of those things, and I mean, because I don't think we have anything like it today.
Not really,
but I mean, it would be fun to go back to those sorts of things and really see how much of it came. Because that was their vision of the future. How much of it really was the future.
You have to imagine that there were a lot of ideas it seemed incredibly futuristic, that it didn't end up going anywhere. And ultimately, this is kind of one of those ideas. But it was such an interesting, and it was really dramatic. I think of that kind of stuff, and I'm like, gosh, this would have been so amazing.
Yeah, and no one will experience that ever again.
No, not like that.
Is truly fun. The sensation of going there with a wonder, you think this might change the world, and get in that tube and have it blown around.
Yeah.
Unless you can fit in the tube at your bank, then you're gonna.
Yeah, they don't. They use pneumatic systems. It's not like they're extinct or anything like that. But I think you could go a life without running into too many pneumatic systems. Like they're not that common either.
Human moving pneummatic systems, I don't think they're very common.
I don't think that was, but it's it's interesting that they did use them in some small cases. His idea on the to do physical mail with just tubes in the city is an interesting one. If ultimately I feel like you're like, that's pretty impractical to have dug all those.
But I think there are whole buildings that use those.
That's also true, though.
Those, yeah.
And it does get mail around.
It would seem like a very complex system. It would be. But I mean, it's when you look, there was a lot of pie in the sky that would have gone on at those exhibitions.
Well, and someone's got to have a big idea for us to change things,
Well, yeah.
And some of those big
nobody
ideas,
there was imagining a smartphone.
No, absolutely not, right? And ultimately, emails, I think, have made a lot of the actually sending physical mail within a lot of buildings and stuff like that. I mean, I think that's kind of you just don't need to send the actual physical paperwork. You
went from filling one box to another. I mean, I'm old. I'm old enough. I used to work at a university, and you had a box, and there was something that everybody was supposed to see. And so what you would do is you would read it, and you're supposed to sign it, and then you put it in someone else's box. And so you go away for a week, and you come back, and your box would be just because
everyone
would
put it in your box.
And now I wonder if they even still have boxes, because now those are in emails, and they're just as junk filled. You can't figure out what they are.
Yeah.
We produce more stuff than we need to. Yeah.
Yeah, but you don't need to have people sign them, because you can just click a button, it sends it to the whole school. Now, whether they actually read it or not is a different question, obviously.
And sometimes you shouldn't hit reply all, and yet that's what happens. And so
there's some pitfalls with it as well. Yeah,
the future isn't always what you expect it to be.
it ultimately, this is such a interesting story of something that gets totally forgotten. And I mean, I think you're right that, part of what makes this story resonate is that there is this tragedy, and that, some of it wasn't his fault. They essentially hit the depression, not the Great Depression, but at the time it was an incredible depression, and it just dries up money for that kind of crazy innovation, and it all just goes away. And I don't know if we would have seen, although maybe we would have seen, some kind of subway system. I mean, what, a decade more before we actually got the system that started in New
And
York.
how much would that change history? I don't know. And it would look different. Would it work differently? It's hard to say. Yeah, there was a lot of innovation that was killed by the Depression. That's true. We've got a lot of episodes that talk about that, where something was going quite well, and then the Depression came and it was gone, and then you have to find your way back to it.
Money dries up.
You wonder where, say, airplane development would have gone if the Depression hadn't so crippled simply the money to do that sort of thing.
So, if you are a fan of The History Guy and you like to listen to our podcasts or watch us on YouTube, one of the ways that you can support us is by becoming a patron on Patreon. And what you do is you'll give us a couple of dollars a month, and it helps us be able to continue producing this stuff. There also are some perks.
There are some perks. It's a way for you to really support the History Guy. I mean, what it's there for, but certainly we let you get some behind-the-scenes stuff and some access to the History Guy you wouldn't typically get. But yes, you do get. I mean, we got our nice stickers that are all over my laptop. We got our challenge coins, all the way up to you can get a personally signed autographed photograph of the History Guy, based on if you want to give some money on Patreon. And I can just say we love our patrons because you make this possible. You make it possible to have a team and employees and be able to continue to produce this stuff. So if you like the History Guy, understand this is what we do for a living, and consider going over to Patreon. It's usually you can give just a few dollars to whatever you want to give, and that is patreon.com/thehistoryguy.
Next up, The History Guy tells the story of the Brooklyn Bridge and some of the interesting historical tidbits that people have forgotten.
On this date, May 24th, 1883, 138 years ago, one of the great marvels of the industrial age was opened to the public for the very first time. A procession of 24 coaches, the first one of which carried U.S. President Chester Arthur and New York City Mayor Franklin Edson, crossed the 6,016-foot suspension bridge, 1.5 times longer than any suspension bridge that had been built to that time, across the East River between New York City on Manhattan Island and Brooklyn on Long Island. The headline of the New York Times that day read, "Two Great Cities United," although the Times gave its relative opinion of those two great cities the next day when they mentioned that the residents of Brooklyn would be happy to avoid a sometimes difficult ferry ride, but the residents of New York City had no great cause for celebration, as not 1 in 1,000 of them would ever find occasion to use the new structure. The Brooklyn Bridge represented the might of the industrial era, the coming of age of the United States and its largest city. There's much that can be said about the Brooklyn Bridge, but it also represented unique challenges of an era of great change, an era of great contradictions, and an era of great architecture. It is history that deserves to be remembered. The carriage carrying President Arthur and Mayor Edson was not actually the first carriage to cross the Brooklyn Bridge. That event had occurred 10 days earlier, and the honor of being the first to cross the bridge in a carriage went to Emily Warren Roebling, wife of the chief engineer. In her lap, she carried a white rooster, which was supposed to represent victory. Mrs. Warren was said to be concerned that the bird might peck her or try to escape the carriage. The bird itself was said to have crowed the whole way and did not seem to appreciate the role it had to play in the spectacle. The purpose of the crossing was not merely to give Mrs. Roebling and her rooster the honor of being the first to cross the bridge, which she had played such a significant role in building, but also to test whether the horse's trotting would make the bridge wobble. The bridge didn't wobble, but New York City residents might not have been convinced as to how strong the bridge was until the following year, when showman P.T. Barnum famously walked 21 elephants and 10 camels across it at the same time. But Mrs. Roebling's presence did represent some of the significant challenges that were associated with the construction of the great buildings of the 19th century. Mrs. Roebling's involvement, in fact, began with an accident. While proposals for a bridge across the East River between New York City and Brooklyn were made at least as early as 1800, the design that would become the bridge that opened in 1883 was the brainchild of German-born civil engineer John Augustus Roebling. Roebling had built important but smaller suspension bridges in the United States, such as the 535-foot Delaware Aqueduct, completed in 1849. Suspension bridges of this size were still relatively new, especially in the United States, and this project would be extraordinary, the New York Times noted. The art of building these airy structures was then in its infancy here, and Mr. John Roebling stood at the head of the engineers, who made it a study. Roebling had made a proposal for a bridge between New York City and Brooklyn in 1852. In 1867, the same year that another of his projects, the 1,642-foot Cincinnati-Covington Bridge spanning the Ohio River, was completed, the New York State Senate passed a bill that allowed the bridge to be built. A New York and Brooklyn Bridge Company was incorporated, authorizing the sale of $5 million in public bonds to fund the bridge. By some accounts, bribery was involved in the deal. Still, Roebling was appointed chief engineer and began perfecting the plan for construction. Construction in that era was done by hand and, as can still be true today, included a measure of risk. In a sign of the nature of the risks of the era, on June 18, 1869, Roebling was surveying the location for the bridge when his foot was struck by a ferry. His foot was crushed and several toes had to be amputated. He died 24 days later of tetanus. His death, the first of more than 24 associated with the construction of the bridge, represented the risks of the time. It wasn't until 1924 that an effective tetanus vaccine was produced. It wasn't until 1928 that Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin, the first general-purpose antibiotic, which could be used to treat tetanus. Roebling's death was a stark reminder that the Brooklyn Bridge was built at a time when virtually any injury could result in a likely life-threatening infection. After John Roebling's death, his 32-year-old son, Washington Augustus Roebling, was appointed chief engineer. A Civil War veteran who had built suspension bridges for the Union Army and played a significant role securing the defense of Little Round Top during the 1863 Battle of Gettysburg, Washington had been assistant chief engineer and, after his father's death, continued to improve the design. Among his designs were the two enormous caissons which would be used to create the foundation for the bridge's two towers. The caissons were massive, airtight wooden boxes of some 17,000 square feet. They were constructed on land, floated to the necessary spot on the river, and sunk to the floor of the river. They were then filled with compressed air, and workers would sit down into them, hand-digging the riverbed until the caisson reached bedrock, or, on the New York side, compacted sand. The caisson would then be filled with concrete and become the foundation for the 900,000-ton suspension towers. It was cramped, uncomfortable, and dangerous work. The risk showed in 1870 when the wooden structure within the Brooklyn caisson caught fire. Roebling was eventually forced to flood the caisson to put the fire out, and it delayed construction for several months. But there were more risks, among them a particular risk called caisson disease. The Brooklyn Bridge was not the first example of caisson disease. Doctors as far back as the 18th century had noticed the deadly form of rheumatism that occurred with workers who worked in pressurized environments. The illness was more clearly noted in 1871 among the workers working in caissons building the St. Louis Eads Bridge. 12 men died from the not well understood condition, whose characteristic painful symptoms resulted in the name, the bends. The cause was decompression sickness, a condition that is the result of dissolved gases coming out of solution into bubbles inside the body on depressurization. In 1873, the project physician, Andrew Smith, noted 112 cases of the illness among the caisson workers on the Brooklyn Bridge, eventually resulting in 14 fatalities. Smith coined the term caisson disease. Among those that contracted the condition was Washington Roebling, who frequently went into the caissons to supervise work. The painful condition left him incapacitated and forced to supervise construction from his bed. His wife, Emily, became his intermediary, relating his instructions to his assistants and reporting on the construction to him. She became an expert on bridge construction and materials and navigated the political waters of contracts and the Board of Trustees. She would later write to her son that, "I have more brains, common sense, and know-how generally than have any two engineers, civil or uncivil." While she fought to maintain her husband's title as chief engineer, she is generally recognized to have been the de facto chief engineer of the project through its completion. Her experience represented the difficulty faced by women in the 19th century. At the bridge opening, Speaker Abraham Stevens Hewitt described the bridge as an everlasting monument to the sacrificing devotion of a woman and her capacity for higher education from which she has been too long disbarred. But the role that resulted in her carrying the rooster across the bridge in her carriage also underlined the plight of the 112 men whom Dr. Smith had diagnosed with caisson sickness. The condition, today called decompression sickness, can be effectively prevented with careful decompression procedures. In 1890, an airlock was used during the construction of the Hudson River Tunnel, an innovation that would eventually virtually eliminate the condition that afflicted Washington Roebling for the rest of his life. But the completion of construction did not end the peculiar risks of the bridge. The structure, a symbol of a modern city, also demonstrated the problems of urbanization. The crowds coming to see the monument to modernism were huge, even at a toll of 1 penny for pedestrians. According to the New York Times, on May 30th, just 6 days after the bridge opened, just after 4 p.m., a middle-aged woman coming down the steps from New York lost her footing and fell. She had been at the top of a set of 7 stairs that were, the Times opined, too narrow when the width of the pathway is considered. The woman was immediately assisted by a bridge policeman, but another woman, seeing the policeman dragging the woman through the crowd, screamed. This set off a chain reaction. The Times continues. Those behind made a rush forward to see what the trouble was. Those on the stairway could not hold back the throng, and in an instant 3 or 4 persons were carried off their feet and fell. Those on the promenade above the stairway, knowing nothing of the fearful crush on the steps, surged ahead with irresistible force, and in a moment the whole stairway was packed with dead and dying men, women, and children, piled upon one another in a writhing, struggling mass. The bizarre incident had killed 12 people, injured more than 30. While the trustees were acquitted of negligence, nonetheless they installed additional safety precautions, including the installation of emergency phone boxes and additional railings that divided the pedestrian walkway into, according to the Times, 2 streams, one going and the other coming, that will, it is believed, prevent any jam taking place. The bizarre tragedy seemed to be symbolic of the city whose population increased by nearly 70%, from 1.4 to 2.5 million between 1870 and 1890. More than 1 million people paid to cross the bridge in the first 6 months that it was open. And the span represented another unexpected risk. On May 19, 1885, swimming instructor Robert Emmett Odlum became the first known person to jump off the Brooklyn Bridge. Odlum apparently hoped to demonstrate to people that falling through the air was safe in order to encourage them to be willing to jump into a net in the case of a fire in a tall building. He also might have been seeking fame. His intent didn't seem to be suicide, but as they say, the problem is not in the fall, but the landing. Odlum had announced his plan and had friends in a boat below the bridge ready to pick him up. Police were there to stop him, but he distracted them with a decoy, the Times reported. A small, black-colored wagon drew up at the rail. A man in a red shirt and gray tights leaped to the rail, raised his right arm straight above his head, and the other arm pressed against his side and thigh, and in an instant Odlum had made good his boast. But that boast didn't go as planned, the New York Times continued. Whether he jumped too quick after leaving the wagon, or destroyed his balance by some movement on the rail or in jumping cannot be known. But during the descent of the body to the water, swift as it was, those on the boat could see that it turned slightly, and that it would not strike the water with the feet squarely down. Odlum survived briefly and was picked up by the boat, but expired a short time later from internal injuries. More stunts followed, and the first known person to jump from the bridge with the intent of suicide occurred in 1892. While specific statistics are not reported, the bridges continued to attract suicide jumpers, some of whom have survived. A mental health expert was quoted on the ABC Nightly News in 2008. In general, for people who live in areas with bridges or tall buildings, jumping is going to be the accessible and lethal means for them. Simply another way that the bridge represents the challenges of life in the city. Perhaps the strangest consequence of building the Brooklyn Bridge is that the bridge has become symbolic of a very strange fraud, characterized in the line, "If you believe that, then I have a bridge to sell you," in Brooklyn. The line is not merely hyperbole. It refers to a notorious con man named George C. Parker. According to the website New York City Walks, Parker would create fake documents and fake sales offices and bilk people by selling New York City landmarks, including once masquerading as Ulysses Grant's grandson and selling Grant's tomb. The selling point was the possibility for collecting tolls. While the bridge opened with tolls, the pedestrian tolls were repealed in 1891 and the vehicle tolls in 1911. Parker would purport to sell the right to operate tolls on the bridge. New York City Walks explains. His greatest con was selling the Brooklyn Bridge. Legend claimed that he sold it at least twice a week, but he did sell it at least several times, including at least once for $50,000. The new owner would discover that he was the victim of a con when the New York City police officers would stop the new owners from setting up toll booths in the middle of the bridge. While George Parker has sometimes been called the greatest con man that ever lived, he couldn't have been that great because he kept getting caught. On his 3rd conviction, a judge sent him to New York's Sing Sing prison for life. The Brooklyn Bridge has come to be a symbol of the city. In their obituary for Emily Roebling, who died in 1903 and was eulogized recently in their series on people who were overlooked at the time of their death, the New York Times wrote, "The Brooklyn Bridge would go on to become, at least according to lore, the most photographed structure in the world. A gateway to that shining city, as Thomas Wolfe once described it, whose granite towers and thick steel cables have inspired countless artists, musicians, engineers, and architects. Still today, according to the Department of Transportation, more than 100,000 cars, 4,000 cyclists, and 10,000 pedestrians cross the bridge daily." But the bridge also represented the challenges faced by the city of Gotham. it is perhaps the very embodiment of the contradictions of the Gilded Age in which it was built.
So very similar in some ways to the subway,
Mm-hmm.
and also, of course, very different. This one was much more public. It's another
Right, it was
really
not a secret. That's true. I don't know how you would keep it that way. Yes.
building a bridge that large.
But I mean, it's also, because it took, the ideas were
Yeah.
forever before someone would finally come to, try to, and it could have gone the same way as the subway. I mean, so this was an idea, and they had different plans. And matter of fact, I think there's a drawing in the video that people mention sometimes because it was done before they'd finalized plans, and the final towers are in a different place than they are, and they're like, oh, that looks weird. Well, that's where they thought they were going to put them.
Yeah. It's an
But
interesting.
I mean, it's an odd one for me because the Brooklyn Bridge is hardly forgotten history.
No, that's true.
But it ends up giving you a lot of room for forgotten history, talking about how we discovered, the bends, decompression
That
sickness.
is such an interesting story, and it's kind of crazy to think that while they're building these things that they were deep enough to be getting pressure sicknesses. I don't think
You
that
think you think of the bends as being people that are diving on the Titanic,
Yeah.
not people that are building a bridge.
yeah,
But that's where we first identified it.
But the whole, which is crazy, and the whole story with, the guy who originally goes to do it dies.
Gets his toes cut off, dies, and that's. I mean, I think I mentioned that in the episode. It shows you. I mean, these were built.
Yeah.
These were being designed at a time when life was a lot more dangerous.
Yeah, gosh.
Any injury. Imagine before antibiotics, any injury could very much be fatal. I mean, it was very common to die. It was very common for mothers to die of sepsis. After childbirth. That's so it is a different. There's a lot different level of risk going on. When you don't know what the bends are and they're shoving you down in a pressurized container, or when if you scratch yourself, you can die, a horrible death of a fever 2 weeks later.
Yeah, that's And I mean, that would have been a serious injury today, but you almost certainly would have survived it. I think.
You wouldn't necessarily die. Probably wouldn't have lost his toes today, but you wouldn't necessarily have died. So he died. His son takes over. He gets the bends, and really, it's the daughter-in-law that ends up being the engineer that does it, and she carries a chicken across the bridge for some reason. That's
an absolutely
fact.
hysterical piece of the
Yeah,
story. She doesn't want to be in there with the chicken.
Yeah, she's afraid the chicken's going to bite her. And I mean, I would wonder why they're giving me the chicken. And they tested the bridge by having them walk the elephants across it from the Barnum Circus.
Well, and I can see why you might want that, because this is a bridge bigger. I mean, these days, usually, I think we trust, I generally trust bridges when I drive on them. Not a lot of bridges where I'm at, but, in St. Louis, I've been a lot of those bridges that cross the Mississippi, and I trust that they're going to hold the car. But I can see why, this was one of the largest bridges.
This was so new. This was so amazing to them that they had to say, could it really carry all this weight? And so we had to walk elephants across it, which I'd imagine the weight of the cars on the bridge are much more than elephants right now today. Yeah.
I assume they've done quite a bit of work on the bridge since it was opened in 1883.
It's still suspended by the same cables.
Oh, really?
The principle that holds the roadway up is still the same. Principle that you always had.
I assume that stuff gets old, so they got to replace this bit or that bit. But
I don't think you can replace the cables on a suspension bridge.
Interesting.
I'd have to look up on that, but I don't think there's any good way to. I don't think they ever.
It's fair. How do you? That's what's holding up the bridge, right? So without it.
And it is amazing. I mean, the cable structure on you see why they call it the most photographed structure in the world. I don't know if that's true, but you can see why they call it that, because the cables on it are spectacular.
Yeah, it's extremely photogenic.
It opened up, a lot of talk about the times, like we talked about, whether you have antibiotics makes a big difference in time.
Yeah.
Whether you trust bridges makes a big difference in time. And that becomes really a story beyond, of course, we built the Brooklyn Bridge, but also, people jumping off the bridge and falling off the bridge and falling down the staircase and the guy selling the bridge. And, this was a great springboard.
To all these different little, that's an interesting one. I'd heard that, the saying of I've got a bridge to sell you in Brooklyn. But it is funny
that there was a guy literally doing that.
There's a lot of times, you get these sayings like that, and we don't really know exactly where they came from. And there'll be a bunch of different theories. But this one is pretty funny that we've got a guy who was literally selling the bridge. And
selling the Brooklyn Bridge, yeah. Well, we did one on Fisher, too. What was his name? Because when someone says, I've got some waterfront property in Florida or whatever.
Yeah.
We got the story behind behind that one too. So yeah, there's that. I can't imagine though thinking you bought the Brooklyn Bridge. I mean, how large would his scam have to be?
You would think
for you to believe that this was a serious enough, endeavor that you would actually purchase the book, because you would think you would at least meet the mayor, right?
And can put up so that because they're like, we're going to try to put up toll booths, and the police are like, no, get out of here. I'm like, yeah, you would think there would be some more professional.
That would be some guy in the alley going, psst, psst.
Here's the bridge. You have the right to the tolls on the
Here's the
Brooklyn
contract.
Bridge now.
Doesn't it look legally? Doesn't the contract look all legally?
You didn't have to meet anyone who you would see would appear to actually
would
have
presumably
the right.
own the bridge.
I mean, obviously there's, those are the kind of people who are like, there's a sucker born every minute for them to,
Yeah,
but I mean, clearly he was convincing enough that these are people who were actually,
but he was bad enough at it that he kept getting caught.
He did
and
keep
wound up
getting
in prison
caught.
for the rest of his life.
which he probably deserves, to be fair. So,
So I mean, both the episodes that we talk about today were really, what was going on at the time. These become a way to see, what was going on at the time. The Brooklyn Bridge was not secret; it was not lost, and yet they, the secret subway were. But they both give that similar idea, and that's people with big dreams and big visions, and they could have failed at any moment. And the way that the public reacts to them and what it says about the whole period of the time. And we still build bridges today. I mean, we built a new bridge across the Mississippi here not too long ago here in St. Louis. But it seems, it just doesn't seem like as grand a project.
Yeah. Well,
but at the same time, it seems to take so much longer for us to do it, And it's another one of those where like, we couldn't do that today. Imagine building the Brooklyn Bridge today, and I just don't know.
It would be a different experience, and it certainly wouldn't.
It would certainly be a different experience. Millions of people wouldn't be crossing it for a penny each.
Yes, right. That's not. We've got all of our other ways of entertaining ourselves, I guess. But I do. This made me think that. I think we take bridges for granted. And this is a bridge like that across the water that it was across. The engineering necessary to build that was really incredible. And it was incredible for the time. But I think to some extent, it's still incredible that how they did it and what they did and how we built.
All those cars going across that or crossing the river. It's amazing.
And they built that
it's a beautiful
before
structure.
cars.
It aesthetically, they built it before cars. Yeah, and that you can drive all this. Every way that you have to get onto the island there is, it's extraordinary because they all are carrying just huge numbers of people, which was kind of the premise of the first episode talking about. You got all these, but how do you build a tunnel under the river to get from New Jersey to New York? How do you move people with the ferry? How do you move people? And then the bridges, each and every one of them is a story in themselves. And certainly the Brooklyn Bridge is one of the most spectacular, well recognized of those.
Yeah.
And who knew that talking about that would bring all this other stuff into light too that's worth talking about.
Yeah, it's really really cool. And some of it is. It really does make me feel like we've lost some of our kind of awe of things that really do deserve some awe. We're so used to, we're like, we build skyscrapers. I was like, it's still amazing that we can do that.
Yeah. Well, the Freedom Towers there, like I said, where the towers used to be. And we have lost awe of the building of the skyscrapers, I think. And maybe, you might even argue that some parts of the world are rediscovering that. And that's why there's towers taller than our towers now and stuff like that.
Really impressive buildings that they build these days. They've got some crazy plans. Egypt is building a new capital, and their plans for it are crazy. It's absolutely wild stuff. I wonder how much of that will actually, come to fruition. Is Saudi Arabia that wants to build a city that just goes in a straight line, which seems insane to me. But I still wonder what that kind of...
Are the places still dreaming? Are we not still dreaming in America? You always get at least some people that will comment on that. And I think that there's an argument that that maybe we just dream differently, or there's always some kind of counter argument. But it is when you look at these projects and what people were willing to take on, and even their willingness to fail. You do have to say, do we truly see the same thing today? Do we have the same sorts of grand dreams? I don't know. But the Brooklyn Bridge is, among other things, it's a bridge, but it's also history, and history that reminds us of where we've been and maybe where our dreams can take us.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the History Guy podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Forgotten History, and if you did, you can find more on our website, thehistoryguy.com. We release podcasts every 2 weeks, so stick around if you want to hear more podcasts of Forgotten History. You can also find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and Patreon. You can even get a personalized message from the history guy himself on Cameo.